When you need to buy goods, services, or contracted work on a project, and you need to do so in a competitive way, then you need to manage a tender process. This means a lot of documentation. So in this video, I want to answer the question, what goes into project tender documents? Tender management is the process of identifying, briefing, evaluating, selecting, and appointing suppliers of goods and services to your project. The process will follow a formal procurement procedure, so you'll need to create tender documentation against which the bidders will be able to prepare their responses to your requirements, and therefore you will have a consistent basis against which to evaluate the different offers that you receive commercially. This will allow you to select your preferred supplier. The tender documents will describe the goods, the services, or the work that you require, and you'll support it with any background information that will be helpful to the bidders to understand what you need and the context in which you're operating. The more information you give, then the better the bids that they will be able to prepare, and therefore the higher confidence you will have in evaluating the supplier, and thus you will minimise the risk to the project. And of course, the tender documents will also outline the contractual relationship that you want to form between the project or the project organisation and the supplier. There are some things that I would expect all tender documents to address in one form or another. There are also some other things that I would expect that many tender documents will need to include in one way or another, but not all documents will have them. They will depend on context, on the type of project you're running, the type of organisation within which you're running it, and the sort of goods and services that you're procuring. A lot of this will also depend upon any local laws or regulations, or indeed any organisational policies and procedures that you need to follow. And don't forget that many nations are now part of larger trading blocs, which impose their own regulations too. The upshot of this is that preparing tender documents is a skilled task, and before starting, you should always take advice from a procurement specialist within your organisation. Often, the tender documents will accompany a formal letter inviting the bidders to offer their submissions, which is known as an ITT, an invitation to tender. Let's start with the set of things that almost every set of tender documents will include. Number 1, instructions for bidders. Specifically, this includes things like the form of the tender document, who needs to sign it, and any deadlines or milestones in the tender process. It will include how the documents need to be delivered and may include packaging instructions, and also can include a label or formal tender return slip that needs to accompany the package. Often, particularly in public procurements, the tender documents need to arrive in an anonymous way. It needs to be impossible to identify who the bidder is from the outside of the package. Sometimes this means that bidders are assigned a unique bidder identification number rather than using their own name on the packaging. In modern procurements, this can also mean using barcodes or QR codes on the tender slip. The instructions for bidders can also include logistics, things like the numbers of copies, formatting, and even a maximum length. And finally, they may also include ethical requirements that the bidders need to meet. Number 2, background information. Basically, the more context you give the bidders, then the better their bids are likely to be, specifically in terms of how they tailor their bids to your particular needs. Often, particularly on big projects, this section will refer bidders to larger, separate information packs that they can read and assimilate in preparing their bids. Number 3, evaluation criteria. This tells the bidder how you will be evaluating their bids, often including the criteria against which you will assess them and possibly even the weighting of each criterion. Again, this allows them to make sure they address what is important to you. If they fail to give sufficient weight to the things that you tell them are most important to you, then that's their lookout, and they're probably the wrong bidder for you. You may see this section referred to as award criteria. Number 4 is specification. This is the heart of your tender documentation. It sets out the specifications for what it is you need, the requirements you have for the work or the goods or the services that you're trying to buy. This section is also likely to cover things like the standards to which any work or products need to conform, along with sustainability or ethical or environmental concerns. And it will also include reference to how you intend to monitor the performance or the production of the work or products that are being delivered to you. Where appropriate, this section is likely to contain things like drawings and diagrams and charts that will help the bidders properly understand the needs of the tendering organisation. At number 5, we have an outline of the contract or an outline contract form. This will usually be a high-level articulation of the terms that you expect to put in the contract, the obligations and requirements, both on the successful bidder but also on yourself as the tendering organisation. There are other things you might expect to see in this section too. Things like KPIs or other performance measures, monitoring procedures, contractual deadlines or milestones, payment terms and processes, provisions for termination, and indeed for addressing and resolving disputes, and a statement of the governing law that you expect the contract to be written under. At number 6, I'd expect to see a contract monitoring section, although it may be included in either of the previous 2 sections that I've discussed. It sets out how you propose to monitor the performance of the successful bidder, either in delivering services or in delivering products. And finally, at number 7 is the contract award process. Once the bidders have submitted their tender, what will happen next? What's the sequence of events? What are you likely to require of bidders? And what's the likely timing? Once again, in public procurement, the timings may well be set down in legislation or regulation, and you have no leeway there. But of course, there are other things that you may need to or want to include in your tender documentation. First of these is either a statement of the governing law or regulations that apply to the tender, or indeed a copy of the relevant parts of that law or regulation. Second, there may be some relevant internal policies or procedures that your tender process will be adhering to and which you require of the bidders. But this can also include internal regulations, internal policies and procedures that successful bidders will need to comply with once the contract comes into force. These might include things like health and safety, equality and diversity, CSR or environmental policies, alcohol and substance abuse policies, data protection and data security policies, and indeed physical security policies too. And thirdly, we often see a standalone section these days on ethical and CSR requirements. CSR stands for Corporate Social Responsibilities, and this can often include environmental policies and environmental requirements that you're placing on your selected bidder. Fourth, if appropriate, there may be a blank pricing schedule for bidders to complete. This is effectively a pricing table that gives set prices for specific items of work or for specific products, so that once the contract is in place, you will know how much each unit of work or each unit of product or material will cost. Fifth, there may be heads of terms of what you intend to be the final contract, or indeed a draft final contract that bidders can review. In some contexts, you might ask them to comment on this. In others, it might be fixed and only subject to final negotiation, where you would expect that any changes are going to be minor. Sixth, there may well be confidentiality and freedom of information statements in your tender documents. And seventh, there may be some social value or community standards requirements in your tender. Is there anything else? Well, maybe. Bear in mind that every jurisdiction will have its own particular requirements. Every organisation will be different and every industry sector will have its own characteristics. That means that what I've listed as a general set of tender document contents may need to be supplemented by the particulars of your situation, and therefore there is no substitute for speaking to procurement professionals before starting to assemble your tender document pack. However, once you have consulted the right experts, then planning and preparing your tender documents can be very straightforward. There's a lot of detailed and complex thinking to go into properly defining what it is you require, but the process should be a breeze for a good project manager. Please do give this video a like if you've enjoyed it or if you've learned from it. I'll be making loads more great project management videos for you, so please do subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any of them. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one.